Hello and welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, joined by my co-host, Matt Giraldi.
What's going on, guys?
And today we're going to get into Beat the Waiver Wire. So this is for week 11. This is our favorite video to make every week. We say it every week. And so we're definitely excited to get into some of these players. We have a longer list today maybe, but we're just going to kind of hit on some names, break them down by roster percentage on Sleeper. If you are here and it's your first time and you haven't subscribed yet, if you can hit that button for us, we would love the support. We're trying to get over 300 first and then up to 325 over the next couple weeks here. So if you could hit that and support our channel, we'd greatly appreciate it. The first guy we're going to talk about here is Christian Watson. So he's 47% rostered. So I don't know if he's necessarily going to be available in your league, but he's on bye this week. So there's a chance that whoever owned him cut him in your league, and that's why his roster percentage has dipped here. Christian Watson, too, he's not going to show up in your projections this week. So if you go and look at the top projected player, he's not going to be there because he's on bye. So I do think that also could potentially be a reason that he's available or hasn't been scooped yet this week. So if you have an IR player and you had Dak Prescott that you're going to slide into IR and that opened up a bench spot, Christian Watson would be the first name that I'm going to go to the wire looking for.
Yeah, and he's got 6 and 7 targets the last 2 games. We know about his big playability. We know he's attached to a very good quarterback who loves to throw it deep. His playoff fantasy schedule is also Seattle, New Orleans, and Minnesota. So if you want to get guys on your team that obviously have a ton of upside that are either cheap or a free pickup off the wire, I think he's a really good guy. And, as much as I've liked Dontavian Wicks coming into this year, and I know he's been running clean routes and things like that, like, he can't catch the ball. I'm sorry. Like I made excuses for him that first game, and it was like, okay, like he went back to him and then he just drops more. And then like, I know the rain game, he dropped that one and it was a bad pass. It was in the rain, whatever, but it's just like, it's getting to a point where like, I think it's also very mental too. So I know
it's affecting his playing time too.
Yeah. So it's just like, we know with Watson, like if he gets those 6 to 7 targets, what he can do with them. So I think I'm going to take a peek in our league if he's available. I don't know if he is, but that might be someone I want to stack. Cool. All right. Never mind.
I did scoop him at the beginning of the week. Somebody cut him going into last week, and he was my top target. I kind of made a note, but yeah, he didn't show up on projections. So no, I was happy to get Watson. Like you said, the playoff schedule is good. So for Watson here, right? I mean, if you're adding him to your roster, do your best to try and hold him because he's on bye. Then it's Chicago, then it's San Francisco. And so it's like those 3 weeks, you're really going to be able to play him? Probably not. But like you said, 6 and 7 targets. Hopefully we see the target share and the snap share stay up for him. And, he can maybe have a big play or two in that week 12, week 13, and you feel better about playing him against Miami, Detroit, Seattle, and so on, right? Maybe he becomes a flex option in a 3 wide receiver league if you've really been hit hard with injuries. Moving on to the next guy. Again, this player is owned in over 40% of leagues, and that's Tyjae Spears. I'm actually pretty excited about Spears here because he's finally healthy. He got off the injury report before the weekend. He's not carrying a designation. He's owned in 45% of leagues, so there's a pretty good chance that he's out there. His projection, not going to be very good, right? Pollard has kind of dominated this backfield. Pollard has been excellent. And Spears has gotten hurt 2 different times this year. He got knocked out in week 2 with an injury, and then coming out of the bye, he had 15 carries in that game against Miami in week 4 going into their bye. It was like, okay, maybe there's something here. Maybe he's finally going to get going. And then it was 6 carries against Indianapolis and he got hurt in that game, only played 20% of the snaps and hasn't played in a month. So I am excited to get him back on the field. It is a hamstring injury, and they are going against the Chargers' tough defense. So this first week, I don't know that you're going to want to start him or anything, but get him onto your roster. And if he gets somewhere in the 10 touch range, I would feel very confident about him moving forward and about his potential to continue to expand his role. He's only in his second year. They are very excited about him as a player. This was originally supposed to be a 50-50 split, but that never really manifested because he hasn't been able to stay healthy. And I think because Pollard has been playing so well, but Pollard's banged up himself. He's going to play. They're trying to manage his workload as well. And I think over the rest of the year, Spears could be somebody that if you get into running back trouble, could potentially be on the field and worth a possible RB2 or flex start if you're in a pinch.
Yeah, I think for deeper leagues, I agree. And I think if I am a Tony Pollard owner, I would make a point to get Spears because if you look kind of short term, it's tough, right? You mentioned the Chargers, but then he gets the Vikings and the Texans. But then for the fantasy playoffs, he gets Cincy, Indy, and Jacksonville. And we're not saying like hopefully you have Tyjae Spears starting in the playoffs, but let's say you're a Pollard owner, he gets banged up even more. He misses any of those games, like you can definitely plug Spears in, assuming he's healthy. So I would kind of view him more as like a high value handcuff. But like you said, do like the player. Just kind of unfortunate he's gotten banged up a bunch this year.
Yeah, and that's another player too, right? That I think the 45% roster percentage reflects the fact that a lot of people are holding him.
Yeah.
And so if you do make a move to add him, he is available in your league. I would try to hold him. Maybe clear some waiver guys or detach from some guys that haven't been producing for you. I know we all get, kind of start to love our players on our bench, or maybe start to overvalue some guys on our team, and maybe it's time to cut bait with some guys like that have high roster percentages, like Xavier Worthy, for example. I think he's pretty easily a cut at this point. He's still owned in 85% of leagues. So it's just like, I would rather have Spears. I'd rather have Watson than him. So maybe moving forward, we'll start coming up with some more examples like that as well for this video. Going over to the players now that are under 20% rostered. These are players that should be available everywhere. So this is hopefully the part of the video that you get to. And especially if you're looking to just throw a dart on somebody that's really high upside, maybe you look like you're smarter than you are in terms of nabbing one of those guys, right? I mean, I feel like we've done a decent job about trying to inform you on these players. Like we were in on Tillman the week before he went off. As just the most recent example. So the first guy we're going to talk about here is Elijah Moore. Same offense as Tillman. But my thing on Moore is that the targets have been insanely high, right? He's had 12 and 9 targets in Winston's 2 starts. That only turned into like 3 for 25 in this last game. But I think overall, when somebody's getting that much work and is just rostered in less than 20% of leagues, and he's on bye, he's going to be free, obviously. But I think putting him on your bench and then preparing to have him for the rest of the season, or preparing to have him at least one more week to see if he continues to get this high target share. I think eventually he's going to get into the end zone. He's used a lot in the middle of the field, and Winston is throwing it at a very high volume. We saw a typical Winston game against the Chargers where he threw 3 picks, but it didn't deter him from continuing to huck it, continuing to throw it down the field. And so when you're a receiver in that offense, it's just a never-ending opportunity to get more and more work, and if he catches a higher percentage of them, or Winston has an especially good game, this is somebody that has good enough talent to matter, and I think you should try and get him on your rosters if you can.
Yeah, dude, I agree, because when we talked about him last week and he was coming off that 12 target game, you were kind of saying, hey, maybe this is his role. And we saw that backed up by a 9 target game. And, speaking of wide receivers on this team, I was listening to, I forget who it was earlier this week, was talking about like, should I cut Cedric Tillman? Like all this production came in garbage time, blah, 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 blah. But my sentiment is that all of these games are probably going to look pretty similar. Like they've got a tough schedule. They're going to be trailing. Winston's just, like you said, going to huck it a ton. So obviously, if Tillman's available, like please go pick him up. But we're assuming that he's not available.
Oh man,
but
there's no way Tillman's available in competitive leagues now.
He's
like a wide receiver 1 at this point. Yeah,
please check if he is. But I'm with you on.
That's
Moore,
a good point,
man.
though. He's only 67% rostered on on Sleeper. So he had 11 targets. He just went off. Like if Tillman is out there, that is the number 1 pickup. You have to make sure he's out. All right. And so moving on to our next guy now, Elijah Moore, great ad if you can get him. Another guy, 15% rostered, is Noah Brown. So I think there's been some times earlier in the year where we kind of recommended to him, and we always kind of thought he was going to work his way into the number 2 role on this offense. And I know I kind of stopped recommending him because I assumed they were going to trade for a receiver. I was very much hopeful that they'd land somebody like Slayton, which you guys know, and he's not going to show up on any more of these videos. But Noah Brown here now over the rest of the season, I think he's kind of solidified himself as the number 2. He has back-to-back weeks of 6 targets. The Chicago game, I'm not going to say he had good production. He caught a Hail Mary. That does not count. But he did still have 5 targets before that, and 81% of the snaps, and he drew a big pass interference penalty down the field, right? He had a 30+ pass interference penalty in that game. So you don't get a target, you don't get any yards for that, right? But we're talking role here for somebody who's only 15% rostered. And then he backed it up this week with another 5 for 60. He only played on 50% of the snaps, unfortunately. right? It would have been nice to see him higher, but I do think in more competitive games that he will play a higher percentage of snaps moving forward. So he's got over 6 targets in 3 of his last 4 games. And, he's been playing a lot more than he was earlier in the year. So I think this is somebody that you can add to the end of your bench, especially in deep leagues.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add with him is it's not super common to be able to add a number 2 receiver attached to a good quarterback, attached to a good offense. So I think if you're looking for like value in that regard, he's kind of a sneaky one. And I think he's like a solid player, right? Like I agree that they probably should have added a wide receiver. Like I understand they addressed the other side of the ball in a big way, which obviously helps kind of trickle down to that side too.
Moving on to the next team, I guess, not player that we would add, is the Miami Dolphins defense. So they're only rostered in 14% of leagues. They have not been good for fantasy. In our setup anyways, they have not had a double-digit game. But looking forward, they have a pretty good schedule over the next 2 weeks, right? You're not playing them against the Rams this week, but then they get the Raiders and New England. And so I think even if you just pick them up for the Raiders game and you're a little hesitant against New England because of Drake May, I understand that. But the Raiders matchup especially, I think, is worth getting them for. That team just has been struggling to move the ball, struggling to score. And so I think the Dolphins have a good enough defense, especially in the passing game. The Raiders can't run very well anyways against anybody. So I think, being able to hold them down in the passing game, having Ramsey go up against Myers to kind of shut him down, then an additional focus on Bowers could really result in a good outcome here for the Dolphins in Week 11. They would be the top defensive priority for me going into Week 11.
Yeah, they're going to be at home too. So I really like this one. I think I'm going to take your advice and pick them up.
The next guy we're going to talk about here is JuJu Smith-Schuster. So his roster percentage, right, it was really trending up going into their bye week. And then he has had this hamstring injury that's just kept him out for a month, and he's out again. So I do think, right, if you're going to pick him up and you have an IR slot, you just kind of pick him up and throw him in there until we kind of see him come back. But I do think that he's coming back into a number 2 role here, but we did see him be very productive. And so I don't know necessarily what the breakdown is going to be between him and Hopkins. Obviously, Hopkins had a great game, but that's against Tampa Bay. Really bad defense. I know he scored a couple times. I just don't know that that's going to be all that sustainable. Patrick Mahomes has not been throwing it a ton, and Tampa Bay is just gettable in the air, right? So like Denver, Buffalo, Carolina is gettable in the air, Vegas is gettable in the air, but not the Chargers, not Cleveland. Like the defense sets up where it's going to be more difficult. I think both of these guys are going to have to play JuJu and Hopkins, right? And so I do think that JuJu has a decent amount of value once he's back in the lineup. I think he can at least be a bench receiver for you. And hopefully, he goes back into a role where he's at least decently targeted. He had 8 targets. That's probably not going to happen with Hopkins, but, I could see 6, 7 on a weekly basis for him in this passing offense.
The important thing is we don't know yet, right? Like whether it's Hopkins or JuJu when they're on the field together, and JuJu looked really good in that game where, he, like you said, he got 8 targets and I think 130 yards or something like that.
Yep.
Like he looked explosive. Maybe Hopkins comes back down to earth a little bit, and maybe that connection with JuJu and Mahomes was real. So I definitely think he's worth rostering, especially when you can just put him in your IR spot this week.
Moving on to our next guy, I'm going to talk about a couple running backs here now. And the first guy is Cam Akers. This is more of a call and bring attention to the fact that the backup has changed in Minnesota. Ty Chandler had kind of been that, but his role had really waned over the last few weeks. We talked about it with Aaron Jones. Like, what, are you just going to continue to give Aaron Jones all of this work? Like, can you please stop before he gets hurt? But this week we saw against Indy, Cam Akers was on the field quite a bit, right? 22% of the snaps, so not a ton, but that's way more than Chandler had been playing. And 6 carries for 46 yards, 2 catches for 7, like involved both on the ground, very productive on the ground and in the pass game a little bit. So this is not somebody you're going to be starting. This is not somebody that is necessarily going to take over from Aaron Jones. I don't think we're predicting anything like that. But if you're looking for the handcuff, you've been holding Ty Chandler, you need to switch to Cam Akers. And if you're just looking for other people's handcuffs to be a menace to society, or you're down in the dumps, you're 2-7 and have a roster spot to throw at somebody that would be upsetting to a different league mate, I think you can throw an ad at Cam Akers and see how he does against Jacksonville too, right? I mean, they played Indy, easy defense, and he did well. His per carry yardage was much better than Aaron Jones too. Aaron Jones didn't have a particularly good game on the ground. So maybe against Jacksonville, he works a little bit more on the ground this week. We don't know, but another easy matchup where he could potentially look good again. So, I would recommend if you're in desperate need of running back help, this is somebody that's available pretty much everywhere that I think you can kind of just throw a bid at and see what happens. The second guy that we're going to talk about is Audric Estime, running back for the Broncos. He's a rookie. He has not played hardly at all. This is a entirely speculative ad based on news that we've heard from Sean Payton before. So just take this with a massive grain of salt, right? Like, if you're adding him, you're taking a complete dart throw. He's 7% rostered, so a couple people have already kind of stuck him on the end of their benches, maybe in really deep leagues, something like that. But they have said now that they expect his role to grow, and he did just play his highest snap percentage. He got his most carries, tied most carries, and he had 7 yards per carry against Baltimore, who is a very difficult run defense, right? So the fact that he got limited work, looked good on it, he didn't have like a big run and then like 4 terrible runs or anything like that either. It was like he was picking up yardage every time he touched it, so it was like he looked pretty good. And so if over the second half he's going to start to take over, we were worried about him in the preseason as a goal line back. So if he's going to have 30% snap share and he's going to operate on the goal line, this is somebody that could potentially help your rosters, and maybe more in half PPR than in full PPR. If you're playing in standard, please upgrade your league to half point PPR. But if you're playing in full PPR, this isn't really going to be your guy. I mean, I don't anticipate he's even going to get any targets, especially with Javonte and Jaleel, both as good pass catchers on the team. But goal line increased role, have to mention him here.
Yeah, I'm excited to see if that role really does increase, because he was a very productive player at Notre Dame. He was a very highly touted prospect. I know that this year's running back class was like a little bit weird because there was kind of so much, at least viewed, similarity. So guys kind of got pushed down the board. With Beat the Wire, like, these are the type of speculative, no risk ads that are more fun, at least, because it's kind of this shiny new rookie. Whereas, some other guys that, like a Cam Akers, is more of like a handcuff, whereas this is like, hey, he has the potential to actually take over, and we just don't know yet.
Moving on to a few more defenses we're going to talk about here. So the first one is going to continue to meet that lower than 20% requirement, and that is the LA Rams. So they actually have been good. Like 3 of their last 4 double digits. And the one time they didn't was against Minnesota, and they scored 9. So they've really been actually a very good fantasy defense. They went up against Seattle and scored 22 points. They scored a touchdown in a lot of these games too. So I don't know how sustainable that part of the success is, right? They scored in week 5, they scored against Green Bay. In week 7, they scored against the Raiders. And then last week against Seattle, they scored again. But I think the point is they got after Geno a little bit. They had 7 sacks. They've increased their sacks over the last 3 weeks. And against Miami, I think Miami's going to be able to move the ball and score against them. But against New England, I think, rookie quarterback going up against a solid defense, there could be opportunities for them to really perform well. So I'd try and get them on your team now for that matchup. And unfortunately, it's not like any of the other defenses we're going to talk about with schedule, right? Because they don't have anybody that you can play them against. You're dropping them against Philly, likely, and then it's New Orleans where you'd feel good about playing them, but then Buffalo and SF. Like, this is not a defense you can have the rest of the year type of thing, or for multiple weeks. But it is a uniquely good matchup there in week 11.
It's interesting because I am looking to pick up a defense in a couple leagues, and kind of all the premier ones are gone. And I've looked at the Rams page over and over and over again this week, thinking that there's a chance that I might play them against Miami, because the way that they looked getting after the quarterback, like Jared versus awesome. Like, I'm serious. I'm probably not going to do it, but there's just part of me that I'm like, damn, they can sack Tua 4 times. Like, I'm pretty confident that could happen. Like, I understand the
Yeah, and it's
secondary
just
can
like,
get,
dang it, Miami
you
used
know,
to be such a good matchup too. Yeah.
yeah. So I like this call against New England specifically, but I'm just, again, like I think they could be an okay play this week, like maybe like 7, 8 points, like depending how your defense is scored, unless they have a score, a couple big turnovers or something like that.
Moving on to the next defense we want to talk about here is the Houston Texans. They're 30% rostered, so definitely a lot higher than the Rams currently. And they get Detroit this week, so the chance that somebody played them the last two weeks probably is pretty good. But they might get dropped against Detroit, so check your leagues. And against their week 11, 12, and 13 opponents going before their bye, it's Dallas without Dak. It's Tennessee, right? Not a great offense there. And it's Jacksonville, right? Not a great offense there. And it's a division game, so it should be lower scoring, more competitive type of game there. So I think I say that as we just watched the Bengals and the Ravens go off offensively in a offensive shootout division game.
Well,
But I think we can
I
all
mean,
agree that the Texans and Jacksonville are a little different than that. But
yeah.
just in case anybody heard that and said, "What are you talking about? We just had a great division."
I mean, we do have a sample of that happening earlier in the year between Cincinnati and Baltimore too, and I think we were kind of hoping and expecting, and we all got our money's worth on Thursday night. But I think with hopefully Nico Collins coming back next week, I hope their offense is able to stay on the field more, which will keep the defense fresh. And they've had like a solid unit. I know their run defense is maybe as good as it was last year, but they've got a lockdown corner, things like that. So I like them a lot in next week's matchup for sure.
The last team that we're going to talk about here is the Lions. So they're 61% rostered. The chance that they're available is obviously very low. But this week against Houston, you're probably not playing them, even though Nico's not coming back. So, I mean, I guess you could play them this week. But the following schedule is Jacksonville, Indianapolis, and Chicago. So for a month here, or at least weeks 11 to 13, I think if the Lions are available, that they could be your defense really for like a month. So this is a defense that I might consider going after. And if you're one of those that doesn't necessarily love to stream defenses, I think that you could kind of go to them for a while and not really have to think about spending any waiver money. If you're in good standing in your league, you have a high record, maybe go to them so you don't have to spend any waiver money. You have a solid defense out there if they are available in your league to kind of tide you over until the end of the year. I think that this is a good option for that. Now, obviously, those matchups aren't exactly like the top end matchups that you're going to use to exploit, like New Orleans or Carolina, anything like that. But Jacksonville, I think they should be able to hold down pretty good. In Chicago, I mean, that's so hit or miss on whether or not they're going to be good. I mean, Arizona just held Chicago down, but then they go off against different teams. So I don't know. I don't know exactly where we're going to be at with Chicago in a month from now, which is when we're kind of saying. So, the matchups aren't exactly like the greatest, but I think
with Jacksonville specifically, like we don't know how long. I mean, Trevor Lawrence got more or less ruled doubtful pretty early in the week. Like if it's going to be Mac Jones again, I would put that like top 3 in terms of matchups, right? Because Detroit's got a good run defense, right? We know that they would try
to. Are you more scared of Trevor Lawrence than Mac Jones?
I mean, yeah, but
I had to get my slide in, dude. I mean, I don't know that their offense is going to be any worse, dude. They might be better.
I think the only thing I can ever picture with Mac Jones is last year when he had that, I want to say it was like a 6-yard touchdown pass that should have been where he threw it 4 yards and the guy caught it just short of the end zone. And it was like the worst pass I've ever seen. And I was like, what, like, this isn't real. Like,
an Alabama quarterback for you right there, right? So in week 11 specifically, right, if it's still Mac Jones, I think that for the general public, that'll add confidence to this play here for beating the waiver wire in week 11. So again, if you're still with us, hit that subscribe button, please. And we look forward to seeing you guys in the next one.
Later.